Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am delighted to have Amanda Lambros from Canada originally, now living in Perth, Australia. And Amanda is a relationship coach, a therapist, an author, a speaker, and an all-round kick-ass amazing lady, not to mention a mother as well, the most important of all jobs. So welcome, Amanda. I'm so delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, so I know that you also are very interested in the space of grief.
Absolutely.
And to get started, I'd love to hear what your definition is of grief.
I think the definition that I like most around grief and how I explain it to other people who ask me, like, what do you think grief is? I really think that it's undelivered communication. It's all those things that we wish we would have said, could have said, should have said, the coulda, woulda, shouldas, right? That sometimes people feel that they didn't have the time to say. And so to me, I think grief and loss kind of encompasses those because that's the thing that sticks with us. But it doesn't have to. And I think that's where I really like educating people around grief and loss.
Thank you. I love that about the undelivered communication. That is a really wonderful definition. And really going into the fact that you're a relationship expert, because so often we think of the word grief and we immediately associate it with the death of a person. But when you were doing your work as a relationship coach and therapist, what was it that made you sort of think, I need to delve deeper into this emotion of grief?
I think that's such a great question because, and I totally agree with you, when people talk grief, they like, if I say, oh, I do grief, and they're like, oh, dead people, I'm like, no, like the whole gamut, the tangible, the intangible, all that kind of stuff. And when it comes down to relationships, I think people just don't even value how much grief is in relationships. I think society's almost wronged us in saying relationship means good and happy and wonderful. And if it's anything other than that, then keep your mouth shut and don't say anything. And I think that's where we've kind of gone really wrong. So what I found was, and I've been in practice more than 22 years. And so I've seen a huge gamut of clients. And when they come to me, yes, they're talking about their relationship is breaking down. So I'm like, grief. But it could be due to finance. It could be due to breakdown of communication with other family members or in-laws or stuff like that. It could be loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations that they had, that they would be going somewhere or doing something, or that their life would look just a little bit vastly different to how it's currently panning out. Loss of freedom. And that is what I heard a lot when I was talking to new mothers. So yes, they had all these grandiose ideas of, I'm going to find my partner, get married, have some kids. But then as soon as they did, the kind of Hollywood persona of what it was going to be like to have kids versus the reality of what it was, it's like, oh, there's a bit of me that's lost. So I can't just pick up my bags and take off anywhere, anytime I want. I now have to consider other people. I have to consider a partner. I have to consider my kids. I have to consider all those kind of things. So what I found over the years was I was talking to all these people and they'd come in with, I'm going to go the excuse. So my husband's cheated on me. I'm really upset. I want a divorce. I want to talk to you about this. But then when we started talking about the underlying currents, it was loss and loss and loss and loss. And I think even at that point, even though I have master's degrees, I was like, I am not equipped to deal with this. I'm equipped to deal with all these other things. And I have, loads of books full of theories and all this kind of stuff. But I was like, a theory is great, but it doesn't help someone get from point A to point B. Mm-hmm. And that's really what kind of like catapulted me into wanting to know a lot more about grief. And I geeked it out. Like, I'm not even going to lie. I geeked it out like crazy. I went nuts. I filled up my bookshelves. I started reading every book I could. I joined every program I could. I was like, I'm going to learn this. I'm going to go through as a participant to see what it's like. And ultimately, I found one that really, really worked. But because a lot of the books are written about theory, and theory, in my view, wasn't really going to help people move from A to B.
Yeah, it's a much more of an experiential learning. And I think, yes, so often people can sort of say, oh, grief, that's not for me, that I don't have anyone in my life that's died. And it's like, actually, everything is grief.
Yeah.
Because life is a series of letting go. It's a series of change. It's a series of losses. And yet it's so, yeah, it's something that's sort of just really misunderstood.
And I think that aspect of change is really important, because people think, oh, well, it'll just be change and then I'll be fine with it. But people don't realize that change equals a new normal.
Mm-hmm.
And new normals are great if you learn how to manage that new normal. Whereas if you haven't learned how to use and manage that new normal to your advantage, then you're constantly looking back going, but I want my old normal.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really fascinating that you brought up, becoming a mother, for example. I just completed a prenatal yoga teacher training.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was really awesome. And one of the things that I'm never going to forget, one of the teachers said, people do more research when they before getting a puppy than before becoming a parent and having a child. And I get it. Like, we're all people, we were all babies, so we all think that's the natural way of being, to become a parent. And yet we're in such a different time, like in our generation, particularly for women, because we don't have to have this old construct anymore of the women stay at home and look after the kids, and women want to achieve things. And like, you're somebody that's like a real example of that. Like, you're doing so much amazing work in the world and raising children. And I'm sure like this puts a lot of pressure on your relationship to have this really great communication. So I wonder if you could just share it, because you even do a course about bringing baby home, if you could talk about that.
And I think that was probably one of my most, my favorite course, I think, when two become three. And I think because I do so much work with relationships, and you watch these beautiful relationships kind of become what they need to be and then flourish from there. It's so beautiful. And then they go, hey, everything's great. Let's make it better and add a kid to the mix. I'm like, what? No, has anyone not told you? No. So what happens is everyone thinks it's Hollywood. They have this Hollywood ideal that they go, oh, we're great, or we have a few little hiccups, but a kid's going to make it so much better. And then they go out, they get pregnant, they do the 9 months, and if it's a great pregnancy, awesome, more power to them. But how much more difficult is it when someone has a difficult pregnancy, where they're regularly ill or they're regularly seeking medical care for whatever reasons? It just adds another layer of stress. And if the relationship hasn't learned how they cope and deal, like their own strategies under stressful situations, and then they get thrust into a stressful situation, it really makes it uncomfortable. And then what happens is out pops this newborn child. And typically one of the two parents is refocusing a lot of their attention on that child. And so the other partner goes, well, what the hell? What about me? Right? And so the minute they start feeling, what about me? They develop a level of resentment towards the child without even really, like, most people wouldn't admit it. And most people wouldn't go, oh yeah, I'm totally resentful of my child, absolutely not. But there's an underlying current. And so they feel left out. So they might work longer hours, or they might hang out with their friends group more than wanting to be home and be there for bath time. And it really starts to put a wedge between the couple, when in reality, if they learned really great skills on how to communicate and how to honestly communicate about their emotions, like the emotional truth stuff, then they could say, I'm actually feeling a little bit neglected. Do you think we could just get a babysitter tonight so you and I could refocus and reconnect? And I think those are some of the really important things. Like, and to me, a lot of times, unfortunately, people get help like 18 months after when they really should be seeking help.
Yeah, it's kind of like the prevention is better than cure. You know, if everybody was sort of doing the work, then we could create better.
I'd be out of business. What are you talking about? If everyone was doing the work, I'd lose my job. But I'm not so worried about that. I know a lot of people, unfortunately, wait and wait and wait until crisis point.
Mhm.
And then they go, oh, let's go and see a counselor. And it really does become like a last ditch effort. Well, at least we tried. We saw a counselor. Tick.
Wow.
And it's like, don't try at the end, try all the way throughout. And so I like to reframe marriage education and marriage counseling so that it starts at the start, because we've never learned how to have a relationship.
Yeah.
And so you're just thrust into this relationship with this other person, and media tells you we'll make it work for 50 years.
Right.
I'm not going to teach you how to make it work, but just make it work for 50 years. Well, of course you've set people up for failure. So I think it's really important that, yeah, sooner rather than later, find yourself a marriage educator, find yourself a marriage therapist who needs to only see you maybe like once every 3 months, once every 6 months, but at least that way you're getting on top of things before they really fester and become toxic.
Yeah. And what would you say is one of the most popular reasons for breakup from what you see in your work?
100% is lack of communication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So there's a little bit of a communication issue that it's like just a little bit of a grind that's swept under the carpet, becomes bigger, becomes bigger, becomes bigger, to the point that you now start to turn away from each other.
Mhm.
You don't even want to engage with the other person because you start building a story about they don't love me, they don't want to be with me, they don't want to communicate with me, they want to do their own thing. And that story gets way blown out of proportion instead of jumping on it earlier rather than later.
Yeah. 100%. So what sort of grief do you, other sort of grief, I know you mentioned a little bit before, do you see in relationships specifically? Because there's obviously the most obvious one, which would be in the actual separation or divorce. And yeah, speak to that and any other griefs.
I think one of the most common griefs in happy relationships is, so people that are not on the verge or brink of divorce, is loss of sense of self.
Mm.
So who I was before our relationship was XYZ. And then I got into this relationship and I thought I'd be XYZ plus plus, but instead I'm like ABC and I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
And so it's like a major loss of sense of self. I liked the person I was then. I don't know if I'm really comfortable with this person. And I don't know if that's the person I want to be going forward. I love you, I love us, but I don't like me. And I don't know if I'm enough to sustain what's going on.
And do you think in that specific example, people should have therapy on their own or within or together as a couple?
I think as couples, everyone should come in together. You get a really great understanding of who they are. Now, when I see couples, my first appointment's always with both of them together, and it's an hour and a half, because an hour and a half gets them in a really relaxed state that they can start to feel comfortable to kind of banter and talk back and forth, and I can witness that, which is great. I then recommend to see each one of them for an hour separately, because sometimes, not always, but sometimes they can individually say things to me that they don't necessarily feel comfortable saying in front of their partner, or that they don't necessarily want their partner to know.
Mm-hmm.
So anything shared with me individually remains with me unless they specifically say, can you help me tell my partner this? And I go, yeah, sure, no problem, I can do that. And then the next appointment, I see them together again. What they do beyond those 4 appointments is totally up to them. Like they might want to come in one-on-one, or as a couple, whatever. But all homework that I set for them to do going forward is for them both to actively communicate with one another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what tips would you give people to try and keep your sense of self intact?
I think one of the best things to do is have a conversation earlier rather than later, and be very honest with, here's some things about me that I don't want to lose. Like I actually love this part of me. And I know we're gonna move into a smaller apartment. And I love being artsy fartsy. And we're gonna move into a smaller apartment. And I almost feel like all of my art stuff's gonna just disappear and I won't have the time to do that. And I'm worried about that. And that's why I'm hesitant moving in with you. Whereas the partner might go, oh, she doesn't want to move in with me because she doesn't love me, or, something like that. It's like, no, it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with, I don't want to lose this aspect of me. And I think that's one example of thousands that I've heard over the years, of people just so fearful of losing themselves that other people misinterpret it as something else.
Yeah, I think that's so great, because we're always afraid of hurting the other person's feelings, and then by not voicing our truth, we then, like you say, get into trouble later on, because then it sort of escalates, and they're like, I can't do this anymore, I don't want to do this anymore.
And initially you didn't want to hurt their feelings, so you're hurting yourself by not hurting their feelings, and then as it escalates, they then get hurt because they're like, what did I do? What's wrong? Why? And they might start to internalize it, which you don't want in a relationship whatsoever.
Yeah, and making up our own stories, that's a big one. Huge.
You're not a good thing at all.
And what gifts do you think there may be in the grief that we experience in our lives?
I think there is such a beautiful gift that grief provides us with, if you're willing to see it and then willing to action it. And I think what needs to happen is you have to have your first grief experience first. So it's kind of like, have a big loss, have one of those that just like really gets to your heart. And then if you do the work properly on it, and you learn the skills of being able to deliver communication so that you don't have those unleft, what I wanted to say, didn't say, all those kind of things. Because people turn around and they say to me, and I'm sure you've heard it too before, of, if you had 2 more minutes with your person, what would you say? And I think that's really, really poignant, because people absolutely regularly say to me, oh, I didn't have the time to say it. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. You did have the time. You just chose not to use the time to make that communication. And that hits people really hard. And it's not me trying to be mean and horrible and nasty, but the reality is we regularly interact with our people, and we have all these beautiful things to tell them, and we make a choice not to. And so I think once you've experienced that loss and you make a choice to learn the skills and the strategies, and do the work, not like, oh yeah, I've done the work, but you didn't do the work. No, do the work. And then all types of communication you have going forward, you actually do the work and you communicate properly. Yeah,
I love this theme of the communication. Sorry, you were going to say
and I think that's the best gift ever. I think it fundamentally changes people and the way they communicate.
I know, it's making me think a lot about, it's making me think about the death of a person, and how, in my experience, that has made me from a very young age be so aware of how life can be so short, and we don't know how long we have in our own lives or with the people that we love. And in a sense, it's given me a sort of courage that if I don't feel like something is working in my life, or I'm really not enjoying what I'm doing, I think, okay, I'm going to change this, because for all I know, I might only have 2 more years left, or
Or one
in
day.
or one night, or yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And also in terms of like, when people have upset you, it's like, oh my, am I really going to get into this, like, about something that ultimately is not really a big deal? Because what is the point of having like bad feelings about people? Because when you hear someone's died, you're like, oh my gosh, it just puts everything into perspective, like all the little things that we get upset about. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously always, as my sister had an argument with our dad the day before, that was her last words with him,
Yeah.
you know. And obviously that has always played on her mind, and we can't always like live our lives all loving and light the whole time. That's just not who we are and our experience. But it does make you think, doesn't it, about
It
choosing our
makes you
work
think twice.
wisely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the really important bit, is because it really makes you think twice of, if this was my last interaction with someone, am I happy with that interaction?
Yeah.
And to recognize we have that choice. That's a choice of how do we want to interact with that person. And if this were our last interaction, am I happy with how it went down? And if you are, awesome, more power to you. But if you're not, then you need to correct that right away. Not, oh, I'll wait till tomorrow and get to it tomorrow, because tomorrow legitimately may not actually exist.
Right, exactly. And it's also a sort of, in terms of like just really speaking our truth all the time, as opposed to saying
So
things I think people want to hear, or, you know, just really knowing what's right for us.
And even something as simple as, like, people go like, how minutia can you actually implement this, right? And I'm like, even today I went out to lunch with my husband, and we were going out to lunch, and this woman was walking towards me. She had the most stunning dress. And so I looked up, and it was like a double take look up, because I'm like, it's lunchtime and you're looking like phenomenal. And so I looked up at her, kind of made eye contact, and I was like, you need to know you look stunning right now. And that dress is beautiful. She's like, thank you. You've made my day. But what skin was it for me to say that? Like, it took 2 seconds of my time. It was my honest truth.
Yeah.
And she's like, you've made my day. I'm like, well, you're very welcome. Have a lovely day. You know, but it takes no time at all to make an observation. And instead of leaving it stuck in your head, you actually just verbalize it. And that's one of the most beautiful things that I try to educate my couples on, because I love working with my couples, but that's part of my marriage education and relationship education that I do with couples. It's like, don't allow things to remain in here and ruminate and become a story that actually doesn't exist. Just verbalize it.
Yeah, very powerful. So I also wanted to ask you, what do you think conscious grief looks like?
My view, I was so excited when you told me the title of this. I was like, oh my God, it's like perfect. It's like serendipity. Um, because my view is conscious grief is just being genuinely aware. And I don't think people are aware enough. I think we live these ridiculously over busy, over stressed lives, and we're walking around with our heads either up our own tails or in clouds, that you're like, la la la, you're not paying attention. Your kid's trying to have a conversation with you, but you're trying to manage emails and all this kind of stuff. And I think from a conscious grief perspective, I think if you were ultra aware and mindful and present of everything that's going on around you, you would be very conscious of any grief, not only that you're experiencing, but other people around you are as well. And so then it gives you more of a strength to be able to reach out to somebody and say, hey, how you doing? Is everything okay? Here's my observation. I've just noticed that over the last few weeks, something seems a bit off about you. What's going on? And so it seems really small to say, be mindful, be present, be in the moment so that you can notice these things. And then if anyone is grieving on any level, that you can actually reach out to them and say, hey, I've noticed.
Yeah. Yeah. So just becoming much more consciously aware. And I think it's interesting this past year, because obviously we've been in the pandemic. So life has slowed down, and we've, stripped a lot of the chaos out of our lives, and I think people
For some, but not for all.
not for all, yeah. But I think that people have had to go inside more than ever before, because we haven't had the distractions available to us so freely. But obviously you can distract yourself through many other things in your own home. So I do wonder that if we are on a sort of tipping point where people are becoming more aware of how they're feeling, and as a therapist, as a grief coach, how would you sort of advise people to become more aware, more conscious, more of their internal world?
I think pay attention to it. I think that's the big thing, is that we get angry, we lash out, we, cry, start to bawl, whatever it might be. But that's like the outward visual signs of what's going on. But it's like, take a deep look inside and go, what was it what was the emotion that came up for me to then feel like that? What was it that happened that I'm like so angry I can only see red? And it's like, okay, cool. That was your outward thing that happened. Now really reflect. Go, what happened? Take 10 steps back. What happened leading up to it? And how did you in your heart feel? How did those emotions come up for you? What was it that led to that? Because my very strongly held view is that we're all responsible for our own feelings. But in a split second, we allow other people to have the control over our feelings. And it's something as simple as saying, she really pissed me off. Oh, did she piss you off? Or did you allow yourself to get pissed off because of a comment, an action, whatever? And then it's like, oh, I haven't thought of it like that. So I think when we're super conscious, aware, and like doing conscious grieving, and even just walking around present, which I think a lot of people are just struggling to do, is really check in with yourself and go, how am I feeling? How does this make me feel? And go from there.
Yeah, it's making me think a lot about how we often want to blame other people for the way that we feel. And if we're doing more conscious work, we start to realize that often we're never upset for the reasons that we think we are. So that person that we're like, they're pissing me off, it's actually probably something, it's probably totally inside of us, something deeply unhealed. And also that people could be grieving something that happened in their lives 20 plus years ago and carrying that around, because we just push the sadness down, push it down, and you don't know when it's going to emerge. You don't know when your consciousness is going to allow you to deal with it. So the more people become aware of their internal worlds and their consciousness, the more that they're able to deal with it, like you say, take responsibility for it, as opposed to like projecting it and saying it's their fault, it's the government's fault, it's whoever's fault, not my fault or my issue.
And I think that's one of the hardest things, is to take personal responsibility, but really really sit with yourself. Again, it's not something we've been taught to do. And when I start to mention this to some of my clients, I have some like big burly men who are like, oh, Amanda, that's a little bit airy-fairy. I'm like, just have an open mind, just flow with the airy-fairy stuff, and trust me on this. And I think because I've developed, over time with these couples of mine, they have a really great level of trust with me. And so when I say, I want you to sit and I'm going to give you a sentence, and I want you to tell me everything that comes up, all the feelings, all the thoughts, all the, all those little things that just kind of start pinging. Those are the things I want you to talk to me about, because when you're aware of them in a really safe environment with someone else, and it can even, like, I do telehealth, so I do online and Zoom calls with clients all over the world. And when I do that, it's like, sit in your own space, you're safe, you're comfortable, you're secure. Now let's take a deep dive to make you super aware.
And I bet those big burly men, they don't feel like they can cry for the first few sessions. It probably takes a little time.
I break them. It's fine. It's great. And I always say to them, I say, oh, it's okay. Your face is watering. Because, you'll see them, do this. I'm like, oh, it's okay. Your face is allowed to water in my office. I'm fine with that.
Well, Amanda, I'm so grateful for the work that you do in the world. You are really an extraordinary lady. And again, I'm just so happy to meet you and connect with you here. So thank you.
Likewise, I absolutely adore what you are doing with this. And I really hope people take the time to, take notes and really take the space for themselves. Don't allow distractions to occur. Just really get fully involved in this and do conscious grieving as much as they can.
Yeah. Thank you. And I want to just tell the listeners that Amanda has got a relationship ebook with loads of great material. And on the bottom of this, we are going to be putting the link to that, to her website. So don't miss out. Check out her website, check out her work. She's also done a TED Talk, which is really incredible. So you can look at that as well. What was it? Date
night's cheaper than a divorce.
Date night is cheaper than a divorce. What an awesome title. So go and as well. Thank you once again, Amanda. It has just been wonderful.